Margaret Holloway did something that winter that people in Prospect Gulch still argue about. She watched Abel Fitch walk toward his father's cabin in the storm. She knew the Fitch cabin was already freezing, had been freezing for 2 days since their woodpile ran out. She knew Silas Cobb's cabin, where she was standing warm in her shirt sleeves, had room for more people and heat to spare. She didn't call out. She didn't open the door. She watched Abel disappear into the white, and then she went back to her children, who were playing on a floor warm enough to sit on barefoot. Abel Fitch made it to his father's cabin. He survived that night, barely, by burning furniture and floorboards while his father's frostbitten fingers turned black. But his younger sister Ruth, 8 years old, didn't survive. She died 2 days later from pneumonia that started in that freezing cabin, the one Leland Fitch had built himself using the methods he swore were superior to anything a shipwright could devise. Now I want to be clear about something. Margaret didn't kill Ruth Fitch. Winter killed Ruth Fitch. Leland's pride killed Ruth Fitch. The 20 cords of wood the Fitch family burned through by January, when everyone else was still working on their first 10, killed Ruth Fitch. But Margaret could have opened that door. She could have called out to Abel. She didn't. And Silas Cobb, who had built the warm cabin Margaret was standing in, who had offered twice to show Leland how water held heat, who had been laughed out of the general store for suggesting that a ship's carpenter knew anything about mountain construction. Silas could have walked through that storm himself and dragged the Fitch family to safety. He didn't either. Were they wrong? Tell me in the comments what you would have done, because I've thought about it for a long time and I still don't have an answer. Let me tell you how Silas built the cabin that stayed warm while others froze. Then you can decide whether he owed that warmth to the man who mocked him. Silas Cobb arrived in Prospect Gulch in the spring of 1878, 1 year after silver was discovered in the creek that gave the settlement its name. He came from Boston by way of San Francisco, following the mining money the way men did in those years, looking for work that didn't remind him of his dead wife, or his dead children, or the shipyard where he'd spent 20 years building vessels that sailed without him. He wasn't looking for silver. He was looking for work, and mining camps always needed carpenters, men who could swing hammers and read plans and turn lumber into structures that kept weather out and miners in. Leland Fitch had been there 2 years already, the established builder, the man whose name came up whenever someone needed a cabin raised fast. He did good work by frontier standards. Walls that held, roofs that didn't leak, doors that mostly closed. He charged fair prices and delivered on time, and had earned his reputation the hard way, one building at a time. He didn't like Silas from the moment they met. Ship's carpenter. Fitch said it like a diagnosis of something shameful. What do you know about building on land? Ships float, cabins don't. Different work entirely. Silas had heard variations of this for years. It never stopped being wrong. Ships are buildings that move through the worst environment on Earth, he said. They have to hold heat in the North Atlantic in January. They have to stay cool in the tropics in August. They have to do both while being pounded by waves and soaked in salt water. He looked at Fitch's most recent cabin, a serviceable structure with single-plank walls and a cast-iron stove pumping smoke into the gray sky. A cabin sits still on solid ground and only has to handle one climate. It should be easier. Most people just make it harder than it needs to be. That was the wrong thing to say. Silas knew it as he said it. But 20 years of building vessels that crossed oceans had left him impatient with men who thought a pile of logs was sophisticated construction. The argument that would define their relationship and eventually cost Leland his daughter started that afternoon and never really stopped. Subscribe to Wild West Retribution and tell me in the comments, do you think Silas should have kept his mouth shut? Would things have ended different if he just let Fitch be the expert and quietly built something better? Here's what Silas knew that Leland didn't. Water is the best material for storing heat that exists in nature. Every substance has what physicists call specific heat capacity, the amount of energy required to raise 1 pound of that substance by 1 degree. Wood stores about 0.6 British thermal units per pound per degree. Stone stores about 0.2 BTUs. Iron stores about 0.1 BTUs. Water stores 1.0 BTUs per pound per degree, 5 times more than stone, nearly twice as much as wood. More than any common material a frontier carpenter could access. This mattered because heat storage was the secret to surviving mountain winters without burning through endless cords of wood. A conventional cabin worked like a sieve. Heat from the stove radiated into the air. The air touched the cold walls. The walls conducted heat to the frozen outside, and the heat vanished into an atmosphere that didn't care about human comfort. The only way to stay warm was to burn constantly, replacing lost heat faster than it could escape. But if you put mass inside the cabin, heavy material that could absorb heat during the day and release it at night, you change the equation. The mass acted as a battery, storing energy when the fire burned hot and releasing it slowly when the fire died. A cabin with enough thermal mass could coast through the night on stored heat, could survive a day without fire if it had to, could turn a modest wood supply into adequate warmth instead of burning through mountains of fuel, trying to heat air that leaked out as fast as it warmed. Stone worked for this. The massive masonry heaters of Northern Europe used tons of brick to store and slowly release combustion heat. But stone was heavy, expensive, and required skills that most frontier carpenters didn't have. Water was different. Water was everywhere. Water was cheap. Water sealed in containers and placed inside insulated walls provided thermal mass that no amount of stone could match pound for pound. In the shipyards, Silas had learned this principle through practice rather than theory. The cargo holds of well-designed ships stayed remarkably stable in temperature because they sat below the waterline, surrounded by ocean that moderated extremes. Ships carrying water casks as ballast, common in the sailing navy, experienced even more temperature stability. The water absorbed heat during the day and released it at night, keeping hold temperatures comfortable for cargo and crew. When Silas started planning his Prospect Gulch cabin, he thought about those stable ship holds. He thought about the casks of water that had kept him comfortable on voyages from the tropics to the Arctic. He thought about how a cabin was really just a ship that didn't move, and how the same principles that worked at sea should work on land. The technique he developed was simple in concept, but precise in execution. He built double walls, an inner wall of planks, an outer wall of planks with an 8-inch gap between them. Into this gap, he placed sealed containers of water. Not loose water sloshing around, but contained water that couldn't leak or evaporate. He used ceramic jugs with waxed stoppers. He used small wooden casks sealed with pitch. He used anything watertight that could fit in the wall cavity and hold liquid through years of use. The placement mattered as much as the containers. He concentrated the water vessels on the south wall, where winter sun could warm them directly through windows. He placed more around the stove location, where radiant heat would charge them throughout the day. He kept the north wall lighter, insulated with sawdust instead of water, since that wall would never receive direct heat and would only serve to block cold. The total volume came to just over 40 gallons, roughly 330 pounds of water distributed throughout the walls of a 16 by 20 cabin. At 1 British thermal unit per pound per degree, that water could absorb over 30,000 British thermal units while warming from 50 to 150 degrees. Released over 12 hours, that was 2,500 British thermal units per hour of additional heat, equivalent to a small secondary stove running constantly, but without burning any fuel. Leland Fitch watched this construction with the horrified fascination of a man witnessing heresy. "You're putting water in your walls," Fitch said, standing in Silas's half-finished cabin, staring at the ceramic jugs visible in the wall cavity. "Water in your walls, in Colorado, where it freezes 8 months out of 12. It won't freeze inside the walls if the cabin stays above freezing," Silas said, positioning another jug carefully. "The water absorbs heat from the stove and the sun. It releases that heat slowly when the fire dies. The temperature stays stable, the water stays liquid. And when your fire goes out for a day, when you can't get wood because the snow's too deep, the water freezes, the jugs crack, and suddenly you've got 40 gallons of water inside your walls, turning your cabin into an ice cave." Fitch shook his head. "I've been building in these mountains for years. This is the worst idea I've ever seen. The water is the reason the fire won't need to burn constantly. The thermal mass." "Thermal mass," Fitch cut him off. "I've heard enough. Build your water cabin. I'll build real cabins. We'll see who's still standing come spring." The challenge was public, issued in front of half a dozen miners who happened to be passing. By nightfall, the whole camp knew about the shipwright's water walls and the proper carpenter's prediction of disaster. What happened next is why I said Margaret's choice still divides opinion. That winter was hard, but not exceptional. Temperatures dropped to 20 below in January, climbed back to 0 in February, dropped again in March. Typical for 9,000 feet in the Colorado Rockies, the kind of winter that tested cabins and wood piles but didn't set any records. Silas Cobb burned 6 cords of wood between October and April. His cabin held steady at 55 degrees most days, dropping to maybe 45 on the coldest nights when he let the fire die to coals. The water in his walls never froze, never even came close. The thermal mass absorbed heat during his morning and evening fires, then released it slowly through the hours between. He slept warm without banking fires. He left his cabin for full days to work in the mines and returned to temperatures that hadn't dropped more than 15 degrees. Leland Fitch burned 22 cords. His single-wall cabin bled heat into the mountain air like a wound that wouldn't close. His stove ran constantly, fed by his son Abel in shifts through the night, and still the cabin struggled to reach 50 degrees during cold snaps. His woodpile, which had seemed enormous in October, was gone by late January. He spent February buying wood at 3 times the autumn price, burning through savings that should have lasted until spring. Margaret Holloway noticed the difference. Her cabin sat between Silas's and Leland's, close enough to see both. She watched Silas leave for the mines in the morning and return in the evening to a cabin that had held its warmth. She watched Abel Fitch haul wood through the snow every few hours, feeding a fire that consumed fuel like a living thing. She started asking Silas questions in early December, quiet questions when Leland wasn't around to hear. How much water, exactly? What size containers? How do you seal them so they don't leak? She wrote his answers in a small notebook, sketching the wall construction, marking the placement of jugs and casks. I'm building a new cabin in spring, for me and the children. I want to build it right. I can help you, Silas offered. Show you the technique, help you place the vessels. I'd like that. Silas also offered to help Leland twice. The first time, in November, when Fitch's woodpile was already shrinking faster than it should. I can show you how to add mass to your existing cabin. It won't be perfect, but it'll help. Fitch's response was to spit on the ground and walk away. The second time was in January, when the firewood crisis was obvious to everyone. Your family is cold, Leland. Your children are cold. Let me help. I don't need help from a man who puts water in walls. My cabin is fine. My family is fine. Worry about yourself. 3 weeks later, the March storm hit. It came fast and stayed long. A blizzard that dumped 4 feet of snow in 2 days and dropped temperatures to 32 below. The kind of storm that killed people who weren't ready for it. Silas had plenty of wood. His water walls had stretched his supply so far that he'd barely touched his reserve pile. He rode out the storm in comfort, temperature holding at 50 degrees while wind screamed past walls that held their heat. The Fitch cabin was already out of wood when the storm started. Leland had been planning to buy more the next morning, gambling that one more night would be manageable. The storm ended that gamble. No one was moving through 4 feet of fresh snow and 30 below wind chill to deliver firewood. By the second night, they were burning furniture. By the third night, they were burning floorboards. By the fourth night, the night Margaret watched Abel walk past her door, they had burned everything that would burn and were huddling together for warmth that human bodies couldn't produce fast enough. Margaret was in Silas's cabin when she saw Abel pass. She'd moved there with her children on the first night of the storm, accepting Silas's offer of shelter when she realized her own modest cabin couldn't handle the cold. She was warm. Her children were warm. There was room for more. She didn't open the door. Later, she would tell people she didn't think Abel would accept. That the Fitch family's pride was too great, that calling out would only humiliate them without helping. That by the time she saw Abel, it was too late anyway. The cabin was already too cold, the damage already done. Maybe that was true. Maybe she was right that pride would have kept them from accepting help. But I keep thinking about Ruth Fitch, 8 years old, dying of pneumonia that started in a frozen cabin. I keep thinking about whether one call through a door might have made a difference. Silas thought about it too. He'd seen Abel pass. He'd stayed by the stove, warming his hands, letting the man walk by. He wouldn't have come, Silas said afterward. Leland would rather freeze than accept help from me. He proved that twice before the storm. That was probably true, but it wasn't tested. Silas didn't open the door either. I'm not going to tell you they were right or wrong. I'm not sure myself. What I know is that Ruth died, and that the cabin she died in was cold because her father was too proud to learn from a shipwright, and that the cabin next door was warm because water holds heat better than air. Tell me what you think. I want to know. Leland Fitch lost 3 fingers to frostbite. He lost his daughter to pneumonia. He lost his reputation when spring came, and everyone saw that the water wall cabin had used 6 cords, while his cabin had used 22 and still failed. He never admitted Silas was right. Even after Ruth's funeral, even after the whole camp started asking Silas about thermal mass, even after Margaret built her new cabin with 45 gallons of water in the walls and found it held heat just like Silas had promised, Even then, Leland insisted his methods were sound, and the storm was just unusually bad. He moved away in 1880, took Abel and his wife and his surviving children to Denver, where winters were milder and his reputation didn't follow him. I don't know what happened to him after that. Nobody in Prospect Gulch kept track. Silas stayed until 1886, building cabins for anyone who asked. He trained 2 apprentices in the water wall technique before he left, young men who understood that thermal mass wasn't magic, just physics applied correctly. Those apprentices trained others. By the turn of the century, water-assisted heating was common in the mountain settlements, though most people had forgotten where the technique came from. Margaret's cabin stood until 1943. Her grandchildren finally tore it down that year, replacing it with a modern structure with electric heat. They found the ceramic jugs still in the walls, still sealed, still holding water that had been there for over 60 years. A few of the jugs had cracked from freeze-thaw cycles in later years when the cabin sat abandoned, but most were intact. The water had done its job for 6 decades without maintenance or repair. There's a lesson there about building things right the first time. There's also a lesson about pride and about the cost of refusing to learn from people you've decided to look down on. But mostly I think about Margaret at that door, watching Abel walk past, choosing not to call out. I think about Silas by his warm stove, letting the man go. I think about Ruth, 8 years old, who never got to decide anything, and who paid for decisions made by adults who should have known better. If this story taught you something about how water holds heat, subscribe to Wild West Retribution. We have more stories about people who built things that worked, and the people who refused to learn from them. And tell me honestly, if you were warm and safe, and you saw someone walking toward a cold death, would you open the door, even if they'd mocked you, even if their father had called your work heresy? I want to believe I would, but I've never been tested. Neither have you, probably. And the people who have been tested don't always give the answer we'd hope for. 40 gallons of water, 2 days of heat, 1 door that stayed closed. That's the math. The morality is harder.